There is a number that Vladimir Putin has spent 4 years refusing to speak out loud, a number his state media will not print, his military spokesman will not confirm, and his Kremlin apparatus has devoted extraordinary energy to suppressing, distorting, and burying beneath a mountain of nationalist rhetoric and wartime propaganda. That number is 1.29 million. 1,290,000 Russian soldiers killed, wounded, missing, or captured since February 24, 2022. It is a figure that exceeds the total American military casualties of the Second World War. It is a figure that has grown by more than 400,000 in each of the last 2 years. And as of the final days of March 2026, it is growing at a rate that Russia's own recruitment machine can no longer keep pace with, not by a margin, not by a rounding error, but by tens of thousands of men every single month. What is happening on the battlefields of eastern Ukraine is not just the deadliest chapter of this war. It is the clearest signal yet that the Russian military, as a sustainable fighting force, is beginning to fracture from within. As of March 26, 2026, Ukraine's General Staff reported total Russian combat losses of approximately 1,292,170 personnel, with 1,210 casualties recorded in the preceding 24 hours alone. That daily figure, over 1,200 men in a single day, needs to be placed in context to be fully understood. At the beginning of the war in 2022, Russia was absorbing roughly 300 casualties per day. By 2024, that number had climbed toward 1,000. By late 2025, the Russian army was sustaining almost 40,000 casualties a month, averaging roughly 1,300 per day, according to British Defense Secretary John Healey. And then, in the early weeks of 2026, the trajectory steepened again. In the first 47 days of 2026 alone, Russian losses surpassed 50,000. The pace was not linear, it was accelerating. And the reason it was accelerating was not a change in Ukrainian infantry tactics, not a new artillery system, not a foreign legion of NATO volunteers slipping across the border. It was a machine. Specifically, it was the drone. To understand why the casualty rate has reached levels that no army in modern history has sustained voluntarily for any extended period, you have to understand what the battlefield in eastern Ukraine actually looks like in 2026. It no longer resembles any previous war. It does not resemble the static trench warfare of the First World War, though its trenches run for over 1,200 kilometers. It does not resemble the armored maneuver of the Second World War, though both sides still field tanks. As military analyst Michael Kaufman observed, the ability of either side to achieve an operational breakthrough disappeared a long time ago. What dominates the battlefield today is drones, mines, and the firepower they cue. The front line has become what Ukrainian General Valery Zaluzhny publicly called a robotic kill zone, extending at least 25 kilometers deep on both sides, where troops on the move become immediate targets for unmanned systems operating autonomously or semi-autonomously at ranges that no infantry can outrun. In that environment, the side sending more men forward is not demonstrating strength, it is feeding a machine. Russia is feeding that machine at a rate that strains comprehension. On certain sections of the front, Russia has lost up to 170 soldiers per kilometer of ground gained, a ratio that represents one of the most costly exchanges of territory in the history of modern warfare. And what is Russia gaining for that price? In the 4 weeks from February 3rd to March 3rd, 2026, Russian forces gained 46 square miles of Ukrainian territory, an area roughly equivalent to 2 Manhattan Islands. For 46 square miles of mostly devastated Ukrainian farmland and shattered villages, Russia paid over 40,000 dead and wounded. The exchange rate is not a military strategy. It is a slow-motion catastrophe dressed in the language of inevitability. The weapon that is driving this catastrophe is Ukraine's drone force, a military-industrial organism that has grown from improvised volunteer operations into the most sophisticated mass casualty drone program any nation has ever deployed in active warfare. In just the past year alone, Ukrainian forces recorded 819 737 drone hits on Russian targets, with every single strike logged in the Delta system with video confirmation. That is not an estimate, that is a database. In January and February 2026, more than 1,000 specialized drone crews accounted for 1 in every 3 Russian soldiers recorded as combat losses on the front. The implications of that ratio are staggering. A nation whose infantry is stretched to breaking point, whose average frontline soldier is between 43 and 45 years old, whose brigades are operating at 50 to 60% of authorized strength. That nation is responsible for 1/3 of all verified Russian casualties, not through mass formations, but through a network of operators sitting in reinforced positions, flying machines that cost less than a used car into formations of Russian infantrymen who are advancing because their commanders ordered them to, and dying because a camera locked onto their thermal signature before they crossed a field. The vast majority of Russia's losses in this period, approximately 87%, came from drone strikes, which now dominate the battlefield so thoroughly that one drone has been assessed as being as effective as 22 rounds of heavy artillery. That single statistic rewrites every assumption about what it costs to sustain a modern army in combat. Artillery shells require steel, propellant, machined components, and industrial-scale manufacturing capacity. A first-person view attack drone can be assembled from commercial components, delivered to the front in 10 days or fewer, and operated by a crew whose training is measured in weeks, not years. Ukraine's Defense Procurement Agency has cut drone delivery times from 2 to 3 months to an average of 10 days, and in some cases to a single day from order to frontline deployment. Russia is being ground down not by a force that outweighs it, but by a force that out-iterates it, that adapts faster, deploys cheaper, and records everything. Commander Robert Madyar Bravdy, one of Ukraine's most celebrated drone warfare officers, gave an interview to The Economist that laid out the arithmetic with clinical precision. Ukraine's unmanned units have killed or disabled at least 8,776 more Russian troops than Moscow has replaced since winter began. At peak periods, daily drone casualties approached 400 troops, roughly the size of an assault battalion, eliminated by unmanned systems alone in a single day. Bravdy's brigade alone claims roughly 1/6 of total Russian drone casualties. The campaign, he explained, is not simply about the pilot flying the strike drone. It is a coordinated system. Surveillance drones feeding coordinates to strike drones, electronic warfare assets suppressing Russian jamming, ground units ready to exploit the confusion, and a review cycle after every mission designed to refine what failed and replicate what worked. It is a military learning machine operating in real time in combat with mortality as its quality control mechanism. And here is the threshold moment that changes the strategic picture entirely. In January 2026, for the first time since the full-scale invasion began, Russia lost more soldiers in a single month than it was able to recruit. The Russian army recruited roughly 30,000 to 40,000 troops per month, while losing 50,000 to 60,000 killed and wounded. The gap between those two numbers is not a temporary dip, it is a structural deficit. The Telegraph reported in February 2026 that for the first time since the invasion, Russia was losing more soldiers than it was able to recruit, a trend that Western officials said had been consistent since November 2025. For over a decade, Putin's war calculus rested on a single foundational premise. Russia has more people than Ukraine, and in a war of attrition, the larger population eventually wins. That premise required Russian losses to remain manageable, painful, but sustainable. The drone revolution has invalidated it. Russia's losses have surged year by year since the full-scale invasion, exceeding 400,000 in both 2024 and 2025. At the current burn rate, the Russian military is not building toward victory. It is consuming itself. The Kremlin is aware of this. The evidence is not in official statements. Those remain defiant, triumphalist, and disconnected from any recognizable reality. The evidence is in what Russia's own security establishment is saying behind the facade. In March 2026, Sergei Shoigu, Secretary of Russia's Security Council and Putin's former defense minister, stated publicly through TASS, "The dynamics of development for strike systems used by Ukraine, most of all by unmanned aircraft, the sophistication of the tactics of their use are such that not a single region in Russia can consider itself safe." Just recently, the Ural region was unreachable by airstrikes from the territory of Ukraine, and now that region is firmly in the zone of constant threat. That is not the language of a winning power. That is the language of a national security official informing his own country that its geographic depth, the one asset that has saved Russia from foreign destruction in every previous war of its history, no longer provides the protection it once did. Ukraine's long-range drone campaign against Russian territory confirms Shoigu's alarm with precision. From an average of 2 separate targets attacked per day inside Russian territory in November and December 2025, the pace had effectively doubled by January to March 2026, with 100 to 200 Ukrainian drones crossing into Russian airspace on average raid nights, hitting targets across an area from Crimea to western Siberia. On March 25th, Reuters reported that about 40% of Russia's oil export capacity had been halted amid Ukrainian drone strikes, pipeline damage, and tanker seizures, described as the worst oil supply disruption in modern Russian history. Russia is simultaneously losing 1,000+ men per day on the front, bleeding from drone strikes deep inside its own territory, watching its oil export infrastructure burn, and managing a population whose appetite for this war is measurably collapsing. A record 67% of Russians now support peace negotiations, according to a mid-February 2026 poll. None of this means the war is ending tomorrow. Ukraine's own situation is severe. Brigades are hollowed out to half strength or worse. Frontline units often operate at 50 to 60% of authorized manning. The average frontline soldier is 43 to 45 years old. Ukraine is replacing its infantry deficit with machines because it has no alternative. And the machines are working, but at the edge of what a society already stretched to its absolute limit can sustain. The peace negotiations circling in Washington and Abu Dhabi remain deadlocked. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has stated that Russia is not willing to compromise on any of its territorial demands. The disconnect between Putin's public maximalism and his military's actual attrition trajectory is not a contradiction the Kremlin can maintain indefinitely. But indefinitely is a relative term when nuclear deterrence sits behind every calculation. The strategic conclusion that the March 2026 casualty data demands is not comfortable for anyone. European allies, led by the Netherlands and Denmark, are now explicitly betting on Ukrainian drone attrition as a genuine war-ending mechanism, not merely a tactical tool, funding drone regiment expansion and long-range strike capability, with the clear-eyed calculation that if Ukraine can consistently eliminate 50,000 Russian soldiers per month, Moscow's manpower problem becomes a crisis rather than a constraint. Russia understands this. During the massive overnight strike on Ukraine on March 24th, Russia expended up to 40% of its stockpiled munitions in a single night, an act of operational desperation, not strategic confidence. A military that burns 40% of its stockpile in one strike is not demonstrating power. It is demonstrating fear of what happens if it doesn't. The Russian army that entered Ukraine in February 2022, believing it would reach Kiev in 72 hours, has now lost 1.29 million men, over 11,000 tanks, 38,000 artillery systems, and 2 submarines. It is being killed faster than it can be replaced. It is being struck inside its own borders at ranges its own security chief admits it cannot defend against. And it is doing all of this while the government that sent it there tells the Russian people that everything is going according to plan. The deadliest day of this war has not yet been recorded. But the trajectory of March 2026 makes one thing unmistakably clear. Russia is not approaching victory. It is approaching a reckoning. And the only question that remains is whether Vladimir Putin will recognize that reckoning before his military runs out of the men he has been feeding into it.